You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Self-regulatory models occupy a unique place in the privacy landscape. Unlike statutory laws imposed by legislatures or binding rules from regulators, these frameworks are created and maintained by industries themselves. Their purpose is to address areas where technology and business practices evolve faster than legal systems, offering flexible, domain-specific standards. By adopting self-regulatory models, organizations demonstrate accountability and consumer trustworthiness even in the absence of strict legal mandates. For exam candidates, the key idea is that self-regulation supplements, rather than replaces, statutory obligations. These models create voluntary commitments that can become powerful compliance tools, particularly when regulators or courts treat adherence to industry codes as evidence of responsible conduct. The scope of self-regulation spans advertising, financial services, health, and technology platforms, showing its adaptability across industries. Self-regulation can be defined as the creation of standards, codes of conduct, or frameworks by private organizations, industry associations, or consortia. These standards are distinct from statutory obligations because they do not carry the force of law unless incorporated into contracts or regulatory settlements. Instead, they rely on collective agreement, market pressure, and reputational incentives to ensure compliance. For learners, the key term is industry-driven, underscoring that these frameworks are created by those closest to the technologies and practices they govern. On the exam, scenarios may ask whether a practice arises from legal obligation or voluntary code, requiring candidates to distinguish between self-regulatory commitments and statutory duties. The objectives of self-regulation include flexibility, speed, and leveraging domain expertise. Laws often take years to develop and may lag behind technological change. By contrast, industry groups can develop and update codes quickly, responding to new threats or practices in near real time. For example, advertising associations have rapidly created guidance around mobile tracking and behavioral advertising. Flexibility also allows organizations to adopt tailored standards that reflect their operational realities. On the exam, the important concept is complementarity. Self-regulation fills gaps while laws catch up, ensuring that consumer trust is maintained during periods of regulatory uncertainty. Governance structures underpinning self-regulation vary but typically include rule-setting bodies, certification programs, and enforcement mechanisms. Associations may establish codes of conduct that members agree to follow, supported by oversight committees or independent monitors. Certification programs allow organizations to display seals or marks signaling adherence to standards. For exam candidates, recognizing these governance structures is key, as they illustrate how voluntary frameworks attempt to replicate accountability mechanisms found in statutory systems. While not government-driven, these structures create internal order and credibility, ensuring that commitments translate into practice rather than empty promises. Voluntary frameworks also serve as risk management tools. By adopting industry codes, organizations can reduce exposure to enforcement by showing regulators they adhere to recognized best practices. For instance, the payment card industry data security standard functions as a contractual obligation but also as evidence of reasonable security. For exam purposes, candidates should recognize that voluntary frameworks often become de facto compliance requirements in competitive markets, as failing to adopt them may appear negligent. These frameworks thus complement legal compliance, offering practical standards that bridge the gap between abstract legal duties and operational implementation. Accountability mechanisms in self-regulation include independent monitoring, external attestations, and third-party audits. Organizations may be required to submit compliance reports, undergo periodic reviews, or face removal from certification programs if violations occur. For learners, accountability is the critical term. Voluntary frameworks succeed only if stakeholders believe compliance is real and verifiable. On the exam, scenarios may test whether self-regulatory programs incorporate meaningful oversight or rely solely on trust. Recognizing these accountability features ensures candidates can analyze whether frameworks provide genuine protection or merely symbolic gestures. Transparency and notice expectations are often embedded in industry codes. For example, advertising frameworks require participants to disclose data collection practices clearly and provide options for consumer choice. These obligations mirror statutory notice requirements but arise voluntarily. Consent and preference management also appear in self-regulatory programs, with frameworks often mandating opt-outs or settings that give consumers more control. For exam candidates, these terms highlight the alignment between voluntary and statutory approaches, reinforcing that self-regulation often anticipates legal trends by embedding similar obligations before they become mandatory. Data minimization and purpose limitation principles are widely adopted in voluntary frameworks. These principles require organizations to collect only the data necessary for stated purposes and restrict processing to those purposes. They reflect international privacy norms, demonstrating how self-regulation often harmonizes with global expectations. Security control baselines are also common, referencing encryption, access controls, and incident response as minimum standards. For exam purposes, candidates should recognize that these principles make self-regulatory codes functionally similar to legal regimes, providing structure even in the absence of direct statutory enforcement. Individual rights handling in self-regulatory schemes often mirrors legal frameworks, but with limitations. For example, advertising codes may provide access and deletion rights, but only in narrow contexts. These rights show a willingness to meet consumer expectations while balancing industry feasibility. For learners, the key idea is scope limitation. Voluntary frameworks often stop short of providing the full range of statutory rights, but still offer meaningful protections. On the exam, scenarios may test whether rights arise from law or voluntary commitments, requiring careful attention to the framework described. Membership life cycles in self-regulatory programs include enrollment, compliance commitments, ongoing monitoring, and periodic renewal. Members may undergo audits or provide attestations to maintain good standing. Auditor roles are crucial, as accredited bodies collect evidence of compliance and ensure consistency. For candidates, recognizing these procedural features is important because they mirror statutory compliance obligations. Exam scenarios may test whether an organization's participation in a self-regulatory program is sufficient to demonstrate accountability. Understanding the mechanics of membership reinforces the operational depth of voluntary frameworks. Limitations of self-regulation include coverage gaps, inconsistent enforcement, and reliance on voluntary participation. Not all organizations join or comply, and enforcement may lack teeth compared to statutory penalties. Critics argue that self-regulation can be used to delay or avoid stronger legal requirements. For exam purposes, recognizing these critiques is essential, as questions may test whether self-regulation is sufficient to ensure consumer protection. Understanding both the strengths and weaknesses of voluntary frameworks provides a balanced view, ensuring candidates appreciate their complementary but not substitutive role. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Digital advertising has been one of the most active areas for self-regulation, with organizations such as the Network Advertising Initiative and the Digital Advertising Alliance creating principles for transparency, choice, and control. These codes require participants to provide notice about behavioral advertising practices and to offer consumers the ability to opt out of targeted ads. For exam purposes, the key ideas are notice and choice, reflecting how industry standards align with statutory expectations while providing a voluntary compliance baseline. Learners should recognize that adherence to these frameworks is often a de facto requirement in the advertising ecosystem. as companies that fail to comply risk reputational harm and exclusion from major ad networks. This area illustrates how self-regulation can shape industry-wide practices even without legislative mandates. Children's advertising is another focus of self-regulation. Led by the Children's Advertising Review Unit, CARU issues guidelines that go beyond statutory requirements, promoting responsible advertising practices aimed at children under 13. These include restrictions on manipulative tactics and requirements for clear disclosures. While not legally binding, SEAL guidelines are influential, and the FTC often views adherence as evidence of good faith. For exam candidates, CARU represents how voluntary programs can align with statutory frameworks like COPPA, but extend protections further. Exam scenarios may test whether CARU's role is advisory or binding, requiring recognition that self-regulation supplements rather than replaces statutory obligations. Consent signaling in advertising has been standardized through Interactive Advertising Bureau frameworks. These frameworks provide technical standards for communicating consent preferences across publishers, advertisers, and technology providers. For learners, the key terms are consent signaling and interoperability. Exam scenarios may describe how ad tech companies use these frameworks to honor consumer preferences, testing whether candidates recognize the role of industry codes in operationalizing legal principles. This illustrates how voluntary frameworks not only address compliance, but also provide the technical infrastructure for implementing rights at scale. The payment card industry data security standard represents one of the most significant contractual frameworks in privacy and security. PCI DSS requires merchants and processors to implement specific security controls to protect cardholder data, including encryption, monitoring, and vulnerability management. While not a law, PCI DSS is enforced contractually through agreements with payment networks. For exam purposes, the key idea is contractual baseline. PCI DSS is mandatory for those participating in card payment systems, making it a prime example of how voluntary frameworks can become de facto requirements. Scenarios may test whether PCI DSS obligations arise from law or contract, requiring careful analysis of sources. Privacy seals and trust marks function as market-facing accountability signals. Programs such as TRUSTe certify that organizations adhere to privacy standards and allow them to display seals on their websites. These marks reassure consumers and demonstrate compliance to regulators. For exam candidates, recognizing trust marks emphasizes that accountability is not only about legal obligations but also about building trust. Exam scenarios may test whether seals provide legal protection or reputational assurance, requiring learners to distinguish their symbolic but persuasive power. These programs demonstrate how market forces drive adoption of higher privacy standards. App Store privacy requirements are another form of platform-driven voluntary controls. Major platforms like Apple and Google require developers to provide privacy disclosures and limit certain practices as a condition of distribution. For exam purposes, the key idea is platform enforcement. These rules are not laws but function as binding obligations for developers seeking market access. Exam questions may describe App Store requirements and test whether they represent legal or voluntary controls. Recognizing platform-driven frameworks reinforces the concept that privacy governance often emerges through contractual or ecosystem requirements rather than statutes alone. The NIST privacy framework provides voluntary guidance for managing privacy risk. Organized into functions such as identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect, it parallels the structure of the NIST cybersecurity framework. While non-binding, it is widely used by organizations to structure privacy programs and demonstrate accountability. For exam candidates, recognizing the NIST privacy framework as voluntary guidance is crucial. Scenarios may test whether NIST obligations are binding law or best practice. This framework exemplifies how government can provide non-regulatory tools that shape industry practice, illustrating the complementary role of voluntary standards. International standards such as ISO, IEC 27701 extend the ISO 27001 Information Security Management System into privacy. These standards provide structured frameworks for building and certifying privacy programs. For learners, the key terms are management system and certification. Exam questions may describe organizations adopting ISO standards and test whether these are legally binding or voluntary. Recognizing ISO standards highlights how global frameworks provide structure and credibility, often influencing contracts, audits, and regulator expectations even without statutory mandates. Service organization control examinations also serve as assurance mechanisms. Society 2 reports, conducted by independent auditors, evaluate whether organizations meet criteria for security, availability, confidentiality, and privacy. These reports provide evidence for customers and regulators that an organization maintains adequate safeguards. For exam purposes, the key idea is third-party assurance. Scenarios may test whether society reports represent legal compliance or voluntary validation. Recognizing society examinations emphasizes how organizations use audits to demonstrate accountability and build trust in business relationships. Cloud provider codes of practice illustrate shared responsibility frameworks. Providers commit to certain security and privacy standards, while customers remain responsible for other obligations. These codes clarify roles and reduce ambiguity in cloud relationships. For exam candidates, the key terms are shared responsibility and accountability. Scenarios may test whether organizations understand the division of duties in cloud arrangements. Recognizing these frameworks reinforces the principle that contracts and voluntary codes often allocate responsibility where statutes are silent. Data broker and analytics firm codes address transparency and profiling practices. These frameworks require disclosures about data collection, restrictions on sensitive uses, and opt-out mechanisms for consumers. For learners, the key concepts are transparency and profiling. Exam scenarios may describe data broker practices and test whether industry codes provide accountability. Recognizing these codes highlights how self-regulation addresses areas with limited statutory coverage, reinforcing the idea that voluntary frameworks fill gaps in the privacy landscape. De-identification and pseudonymization practices are also codified in industry guidance. These frameworks provide technical and procedural standards for reducing identifiability while maintaining utility. For exam candidates, the key terms are de-identification and pseudonymization. Scenarios may test whether data processed under these practices remains subject to statutory obligations. Recognizing these practices emphasizes how voluntary guidance helps operationalize legal requirements while balancing innovation and privacy. Algorithmic fairness charters represent emerging self-regulatory models addressing bias in automated systems. Companies and industry groups have adopted principles requiring transparency, explainability, and bias mitigation in artificial intelligence. For learners, the key idea is fairness. Exam scenarios may describe algorithmic practices and test whether self-regulatory frameworks provide governance. These charters illustrate how voluntary models expand privacy into ethical and social concerns, reflecting the evolving nature of governance in the digital era. Organizational adoption of voluntary frameworks requires integration with internal policies and controls. Companies often use adoption playbooks to align external standards with governance structures, training, and monitoring. For exam purposes, the key term is alignment. Scenarios may test whether organizations effectively embed voluntary frameworks into daily practice. Recognizing adoption patterns reinforces the principle that self-regulation is most effective when operationalized, not simply endorsed. This final concept highlights how voluntary frameworks complement statutory law, creating a layered system of governance that balances legal mandates, industry standards, and organizational accountability. By mastering self-regulatory models, candidates understand how industry codes, voluntary frameworks, and contractual standards fill gaps in statutory regimes. These mechanisms provide flexibility, technical detail, and market-driven accountability, ensuring that privacy governance evolves alongside technology. For exam success and professional practice, recognizing the complementary role of self-regulation prepares learners to evaluate frameworks not only as legal supplements, but also as practical tools for building trust and managing risk. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.